The Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. Together, reducing fraud worldwide.
I think obviously managers are going to like the benchmarking report, but I don't think you have to be a manager. I think in a lot of the situations, while some of our CFEs and members are managers overseeing a fraud department, there are a lot who are just members, but I think it can be valuable if you have any feedback for your management team saying that we should take this action to make our team better. Or maybe you're setting up a new fraud investigation team at an organization and you just want some guidelines. You don't have any internal data to compare with how many fraud examiners do we need, who are they going to report to and things like that. And so I think it's really valuable to be able to go to this report and say, well, this is how other people are doing it. And so I think that is who's going to be using it, people who are setting up new teams or improving teams, or people who just have suggestions for management or maybe clients. So if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of the report, you can get more specific statistics about organizations like yours. So you can find things about people in your industry or your organization or your region. And so we think that when you're looking for findings, that'll be the best way to do it, is to look at organizations that are like yours. But some of the overall general findings we found in terms of structure was how many fraud examiners work at organizations in their internal departments. And we found that the average was 5.1 per 1,000 employees over all organizations, over all industries. So for every 1,000 employees you had 5.1 fraud examiners. And one of the interesting things we found about the fraud examiners is that they weren't, at least about half of them spent 50% or less of their time actually investigating fraud. And what that shows us is that fraud investigators tend to have diverse skill sets. A lot of our members are CPAs, and so they might be on the fraud investigation team, but they do other things too. Maybe they do accounting work, or maybe they're a manager or something like that. And so when you think fraud investigation team, we found that the data shows that you're not necessarily thinking people who just all day long investigate fraud cases. They might have a very diverse background. So we also measured the effectiveness of performance metrics, which means we wanted to know if you have a performance metrics that you're evaluating your fraud examination team, which one is the best one and which one is the worst one. And the way that we measured that was how many fraud losses do you recover, or do organizations recover, when they have this metric in place. And so one of the strange things that we found was that when an organization was using the most common metric, which is the number of cases closed year over year, that was actually the worst reported metric in terms of the fraud losses that organization recovered. So we saw that organizations that were evaluating their teams with more qualitative metrics instead of quantitative metrics, such as how many cases are reported to law enforcement or how many fraud cases are substantiated, those tended to do much better than when you were looking at quantitative metrics. And so even though most people use quantitative metrics, or that's most common, it might actually behoove them to switch to qualitative metrics, or maybe do both, because you can do both. The feedback so far has been really good. I think people are finally glad that when they ask this question, do you have this information? Finally, we can say, yes, here it is. And I think it's really valuable for when they're going back to their managers, or maybe almost everyone has a boss in the organization. And so when you go back to them and say, we should make this change to the organization, I think people have been really receptive to the fact that they have this empirical data, because everyone can say, well, this is what I think should happen. But when you have this data that says this is what other organizations are doing, and it's, this is what we should be doing also, I think people really appreciate that. So the feedback there has been good so far. And we also received just some overall arching different things that we should explore. We looked at how long cases take, or how many fraud investigators. But I think a neat suggestion that we received was try to measure complexity of cases, because sometimes that can have an effect on how much resources you need for your fraud investigation team. And by complexity, I mean measuring things like how many interpreters are needed. If it's a fraud case that involves international jurisdictions, are we speaking a lot of different languages? Are we dealing with jurisdictions with different laws? or large amounts in controversy. These are things that can make a fraud case more complex, and so maybe change how we act with that, how our fraud team is structured, or the performance of that fraud team. So I think suggestions like that have been really interesting, and we might try to incorporate those into the future reports.